Good morning to all those faithful folks that have made it through the snow. Welcome, glad to have you here. We delayed our opening by half hour to give people time to make it through the snow. I know others are still on the way. So thank you for your efforts to get here, and glad everybody's made it safely to this point. So we do have a quorum on each side. So with that, would you please call the roll for us?
Chairman Grow,
Here.
Bierke, Burtonshaw, Lent, Cook, Van Orden, Adams, Herndon, Ward Engelking, Just, Representative Horman, here. Miller, present. Bundy, here. Raybold, Furness, here. Lambert, Tanner, Petsky, here. Handy, Green.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Let's jump right into it since we've already lost a half hour, and we appreciate the patience of everybody in the audience here as well for bearing with us as we try to get a quorum, which we just got just now. So the timing was perfect. So we will begin with Mr. Bybee. If you'd like to come forward and just FYI, excuse me. Tomorrow, we feel we've got a little extra time on the agenda for tomorrow. So if we end up not being able to get everybody today, we'll roll a couple of things into tomorrow. So we'll make sure you get everything, so we're good to go. Mr. Bybee, please identify yourself for the record and begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We had these mics adjusted a little bit on this remote mic, so I think we should not be as tinny as we were yesterday. But my hat's off to Mr. Shane Winslow and our audio-video consultants that help kind of keep this room up in good running shape. So thank you. So without much further ado, I'll jump right into it. So my goal this morning is to go over the FY 2024 and FY 2025 anticipated general fund budget. Today I'm going to cover briefly a little bit about general fund revenues and expenditure history. I'll go through the cash reconciliation in FY 2024 and FY 2025. And oh, by the way, I have loaded into the SharePoint the budget book pages I'm going to be working through specifically. That's budget book page 6 and 7. Those are the two cash reconciliation pages. They're a comparative analysis. So you can find that in your SharePoint if you want to go look at there and follow around and check to make sure that my numbers are correct, but I'm driving this report right from those numbers, okay? After that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sales tax distributions. That seems to be on top of mind of everyone's opinion right now, and then spend a little time talking about rainy day funds and revenue volatility, okay? All right. So first slide, most of you are getting used to seeing how I present this information. And so this is our current budget picture going back to FY 2020-13. The dashed lines, of course, are the forecasted amounts or the budgets to be set in fiscal year 2024 as we finalize those budgeted amounts. But effectively, those dashed lines right now represent the governor's forecast amounts or budget proposals out there. And just to reemphasize what Mr. Adams talked about yesterday, starting to steal some of my talking points these days about structural balance. You can see that large gap between ongoing revenues and expenditures on the general fund right there. So that is a pretty good gap, although it is starting to shrink. You can see in anticipated fiscal year 2024, you're about $5.6 billion of revenue versus almost $5.2 billion of expenditures. So just from the fall, just to remind everyone, we were sitting around a $700 million gap, and now we're closer to a $400 million gap. So these are all structural balances and what you would hope to see in a budget, particularly as large as our general fund budget has gotten these past few years. You can see the really big spike in revenues that created the big billion-dollar surpluses that we had in consecutive years. But also, what you notice about the dashed line is we're not quite down to historical trend line analysis there. So if you look back to 2020 where our historical budgets were, we're still a little bit above that historical one. And so that's just a kind of level setting piece of information. The second thing that I should talk about here is, of course, our general fund obligations. Now, I spent a little bit of time talking about how the surplus was used over the course of the fall and in Economic Outlook Committee. And so what you're seeing is the addition of those cash balances in the red line and then the total general fund obligations. And the thing that I want to highlight here is when you get out to 2026, you're starting to see how that line is narrowing. And that's narrowing both because of that estimated ending balance and carry forward amount, plus the amount of obligations that are currently happening with the general fund. And so as we develop our theory of the case and staying risk averse on general fund to make sure that there is sufficient cash to cover obligations, these are things that we need to keep top of mind going forward. The other thing I need to point out is these revenue lines do include the governor's proposals for reduction of $175 million of sales tax. So it's slightly off the line that was presented yesterday, but it includes those proposed reductions, just to give you a clean sense of where we stand today. So that's just a reminder, it's $125 million for the school facilities, carve out of the sales tax, and $50 million additional for Techum. That's what's included in that $175 million change there, okay? And just one more, for fiscal year 2026, the growth on the budget is going back to our current annual average rate of growth from 2013 to 2024, which was a 5.6%. And as I mentioned earlier, we're a little bit higher than the normal budget growth line of 2013 to 2020. But when you start to add in all those general fund obligations, that's what's kind of washing it out. And so I say that because you know that there is some additional cushion in there. A lot of that one-time money is being washed out throughout that piece, okay? All right, so speaking of obligations, I've updated this table as well to give the committee a good sense of all of the historic budget surpluses you've put into savings accounts, infrastructure, and natural resources, okay? And so let's talk about fiscal year 2024 very briefly, right? So last year, as part of Senate Bill 1211, it authorized a transfer of $29.3 million to the Public Education Stabilization Fund if there was room in that cap. And so what we knew towards the end of last session is that our support units were trending down and that there was probably going to be another statutory deposit into PSIF without the additional general fund deposit into PSIF. And so practically what happened in August is that transfer didn't occur. And so that line that you would have seen at, excuse me really quickly, $746 million in total for fiscal year 2024 was reduced by that $29.3 million for the PSIF amount that didn't happen. And so that amount stayed in the general fund currently, okay? Otherwise, what you see in the FY 2025 proposed column is for ITD, bridges, and locals, you see $502 million as being proposed, $25 million for a secure mental health facility at the Permanent Building Fund, another $24 million deposit that Mr. Adams covered yesterday with deposit into Budget Stabilization Fund, $55 million for natural resources. That's the $30 million for water resources. That includes the money for quagga mussel remediation. That includes some money for parks. All told, right now, spending down those budgeted surpluses and cash balance over these 5 years. The projection is at $5.6 billion. It's as large as our general fund budget is currently. Okay. Now it's time for the wall of numbers here. So this committee is a detailed-oriented committee, and so I'm going to spend some time looking at the numbers. And so forgive me a little bit. I hope to do some pretty good job of describing the moving pieces and parts. But this is where we're on page 6 and 7 of the front end of the legislative budget book. And so the things that I want to note start with that unobligated cash balance. So one thing this committee should know is that thus far, we've been unable to independently verify those cash balances that you're seeing to begin the year. This is something that we're continuing to work on and continuing to improve our processes. But one thing to note is that when you look at line 3 for executive carry forward, there's a slight difference between those numbers on the general fund request amount and the executive carry forward amount. Now, what you're seeing here is the effect of we were still trying to get a good handle on the approval of executive carry forward over the course of the fall. But the effect that it has is a reduction in what could have been available cash balances at the end of the year. So you all remember that we had a surplus eliminator that verified that we had to end the year with $416 million on the bottom line. Now, the way that we calculated that is that we had to first account for cash in the Treasury to cover reappropriation. We had to have cash in the Treasury to verify executive carry forward, otherwise known as encumbrances, right? And then we know what our surplus is. But as we knew that there were problems with executive carry forward, problems with reappropriation as we close the books throughout the year, and we found those things throughout the fall, we know that that cash balance isn't exactly right on right now. And so right now what we're trying to do is independently verify that that cash balance is the correct cash balance going forward. And so we've been working really hard to figure that one out, but there is still some question marks that we need to have resolved. While I'm here, I should probably spend some time talking about reappropriation and carryover, just so the committee has terminology straight, right? So reappropriation, directly from the glossary of the legislative budget book, it allows unused spending authority from one fiscal year to be carried over into the next fiscal year for one-time expenses. So this is legislatively authorized reappropriation authority. A great example of this is when this committee approved last year the $10 million to the Secretary of State for the new election system, election management system, right? So we authorized the Secretary of State to carry over that $10 million, or excuse me, it was supposed to be a supplemental. Now I'm a little bit sideways on there, but the principle still applies. Practically, you would have used that $10 million over the course of the spring, and then they would have been able to continue spend against that in the fall. And that was with legislative authorization. That's what reappropriation is there for. When you look at executive carry forward, it's a similar principle applied here, only a little bit different. So these were already budgets that had been authorized by the legislature, but they were for encumbrances. In accounting terms, what you are setting aside is, so say you want to go through a purchase order to purchase a vehicle, and that encumbrance happens to overlap 2 fiscal years. Well, what the agency doesn't have in this case anymore with a law change is the ability to point back in time and say, we're using last year's budget to pay for this year's encumbrance. And so what they have to do is there is specific guidance in Idaho code that allows the agency to have approved by the Division of Financial Management monies for that same purchase order to pay it off in the following fiscal year. So they're spending against last year's appropriation, and this is a way mechanically to increase the appropriation for the year.
Mr. Bybee, question for you, or clarification for everybody. So if we understand correctly, that's reappropriation, it's a spending authority is what we're giving, but it's not increasing the subsequent year's budget, is that correct? Or is it?
Mr. Chairman, it does increase the subsequent year's budget.
Okay.
And you can see that as evidence on this slide here. So what we're doing is it's a reservation of the cash from the previous year, but on line 19, the way that you would think about that is that you would add the $30 million from, let's make sure, $43.6 million from reappropriation and $30 million of executive carry forward together, so that what you see on line 19 is $74.2 million. So that has the effect of increasing the total appropriation in fiscal year 2024 from $5.18 billion on line 18, and it adds that $74 million to it, okay?
If I may clarify then, so that shows up in both budgets, even though it's only spent once. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, you have that part correct.
Okay,
Yep,
thank
thank you for that clarification. Okay. All right, so let's just spend a little bit more time on this table, and as always, please do ask questions as we go along here. I'd be happy to address it in the moment rather than down the road, okay? All right, so the addition of the cash that wasn't expended for reappropriation, or we reserved it for reappropriation, we reserved the cash for executive carry forward, and then every year annually, the Department of Health and Welfare takes about 2 additional months to make sure that the cost allocations between all their federal grants, between general and federal, what you see is addition of cash for an after year-end reversion from the Department of Health and Welfare, and the addition of cash from the Permanent Building Fund from a lack of $32.6 million. So total cash available for the year is pretty close to that $523 million right there. One more note about that after year-end reversion from admin, as you see on line 4, that $14.3 million was part of the over $500 million that was appropriated for bond defeasance 2 years ago. And so that is the amount that wasn't actually expended, that $14.3 million that wasn't needed. And so it was reverted back to the general fund in about September. So that is our starting balance on cash. Now, this is the greatest time as any to talk about the differences of the columns, right? So what we have is a current law and request versus the governor's recommendation. And so what you see in that middle column under current law is the revenue forecast or revenue projection set by the legislature when we adjourned signing die last year, $5.78 billion. The new calculation is a 2.8% reduction from the FY 2023 actual expenditure, actual revenue collections. And so that's going to be one of the main differences between the two columns at the outset, is just where the legislature had set that revenue projection versus what the new proposed revenue forecast by the Division of Financial Management looks like, right? So on line 7, under the governor's column, what you see is a 10.7% total general fund reduction. Now, what we're doing here is we're adding back the $330 million for public schools that was carved out of the sales tax distribution, so that we're ensuring that general funds are still accounted for both on the revenue and expenditure side of the equation. So all told, governor's revenue forecast is at a 5.1% reduction from FY 2023 at $5.6 billion, leaving total revenues and estimated balances at $6.16 billion in the governor's column. It's a little bit lower than last year's revenue forecast. All right. So now we're into kind of the meat of the revenue adjustments part of the sheet. And so as I was mentioning on slide 2, some of these could be deemed as general fund obligations, right? Some of that $746 million that you see on line 11 could be termed as a general fund obligation.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question real quick?
Thank you. Go ahead, Representative Tanner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bybee, I saw that you put HB 1 on there. So was HB 292, was that calculated into there as well?
Mr. Bybee.
The sales tax as well.
And Representative Tanner. So in that $5.78 billion revenue forecast number, House Bill 1 is included in that. House Bill 292 is included in that.
Follow up? You're good?
Thanks for the clarification.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So back to this next part of the cash reconciliation table. On line 11, what you see are the general fund obligations and transfers into savings account as authorized by this legislature last session, $746 million. You can see on line 14, we're accounting for the lack of the transfer to the Public Education Stabilization Fund from Senate Bill 1211 of 2023. So we're adding cash back as a revenue adjustment here. The other thing that to highlight here is the $649,900 is for deficiency warrants for invasive species and hazardous materials. You'll soon hear from my colleague, Ms. Jessup, that invasive species number clearly doesn't include the $5 million for quagga mussels. We have a new budget for that in fiscal year 2025. So this is just to remind everyone, deficiency warrants works as a backward looking. So we've authorized an agency to spend against the general fund in order to pay for a declared emergency, and the legislature either refills those accounts at the end of the year after the account balances has been figured out. Further, now we're starting to really account for cash going through here. Line 13 is an adjustment from the closeout of the catastrophic healthcare fund. We're adding $11.4 million to that one. That was from House Bill 70 of last year. And then finally, on line 15, there's a public defense cash reconciliation adjustment in the governor's budget. Last year at the end of session, when the legislature was trying to fix, in air quotes, fix House Bill 292 and make sure the cash was right for the public defense fund, I think there was an additional transfer of $36 million that isn't necessary going forward. That would go out to help pay for public defense of the counties. And so this $36 million would take an affirmative action by the legislature to transfer that cash back to the general fund. All told, the proposed revenue adjustments.
Mr. Bybee, if I may
Yes, sir.
ask a question, then say that'll take action by the legislature. Is that policy bill that would have to pass, or is that something we can do here in JFAC on 36 million?
Mr. Chairman, that is in the purview of JFAC to transfer that cash.
Thank you.
It is an appropriation.
Thank you.
All right, all told, on line 17, this is the total amount of projected revenues for fiscal year 2024, $5.4 billion in the governor's budget, almost $6 billion on the current law budget. I showed this slide a little bit earlier just to highlight some of the things in it. So what you would see here is the addition of that $74 million for reappropriation and executive carry forward to the original appropriation level of $5.18 billion on line 18. And then what I'm showing is a high level of supplemental requests and or rescissions. This year is a big year for rescissions, most notably from the Medicaid budget, a reduction of $92,877,200. All of those supplemental and rescissions net out to a reduction of current appropriations of $71,855,000. So practically, it's a wash between reappropriation, executive carry forward, and the rescissions authorized. And so the budgeted level that you set last year of $5.18 billion, the estimated expenditures for the rest of 2024, if you follow the governor's plan exactly, would be $5.183 billion, just over a $2 million increase year over year, or from last session to this session. This next slide is going to be a summed up, a rolled up cash reconciliation of the general fund summary. So what you'll see here is online the beginning cash balance of $523 million, add that to the revenue projections and reduce by total transfers out Total revenues, $5.4 billion. Netted against the estimated expenditures, and down on line 10, you see what the projected ending balances are. $314 million in the governor's budget, $417 under current law. Okay. Moving into 2025, this cash reconciliation isn't going to take into account any surplus eliminator, because by definition that surplus eliminator is going to be over and above that ending balance, whatever the legislature sets, after accounting for reappropriation and executive carry forward. So we need to get cash right, and then we can determine what that surplus eliminator looks like, okay? Same number, 314 million carried over into fiscal year 2025. You see the governor's revenue projection at a 7.2 increase, adding that $330 million from House Bill 1 back to the revenue thing to get our revenues and appropriations correct. And then you see the revenue reductions on lines 4 and 5 marching down this table for a total revenue projection of $5.8 billion without the adjustments and just taking into account the governor's forecast of $6 billion. So $170 million difference between the two, $175 million.
Mr. Chairman.
Who's asking? Oh, yes, Senator Ward Engelking. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Bybee. I was just wondering, H1, 330 for public schools, but we had 80 million for higher ed. I'm not seeing that on here. Is that in a different place?
Go ahead, Mr. Bybee.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman and Senator Ward Engelking. The $80 million of launch. So in total, House Bill 1 carved out $410 million from the sales tax distribution formula that otherwise would have gone to the general fund. The $80 million of launch goes into its own account. And I'm forgetting the name of the fund off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But it's carved out.
In-demand careers.
The In-Demand Careers Fund. Thank you very much. It's the phone a friend portion of the presentation. Thank you. And so the way that we are currently accounting for that is that we're calling that amount a dedicated fund, similar to the way that we're describing the 4.5% reduction for the Transportation Expansion Congestion Mitigation Fund that goes to ITD. We're calling that a dedicated fund, even though they otherwise would have historically gone to the general fund. Stay tuned on that one later. I have a neat slide that I prepared. I'm happy with it. So, all right. All told, our total revenues and estimated cash right now are at $6.1 billion under the governor's budget, $6.4 billion without making those revenue adjustments on 4 and 5. All right, speaking of other revenue adjustments, here is the governor's proposal for spending general fund obligations at agencies plus appropriations into savings accounts. So the first one on line 8, you see a request for $17 million to fill up the Fire Suppression Deficiency Fund. On line 9, you would see the request from the Department of Transportation of $302 million for the Strategic Initiatives Fund, $25 million for the Permanent Building Fund, that's for the Secure Mental Health Facility, $2 million for confined animal feeding operations, go to DEQ to monitor that, $30 million for water resources, another $200 million to local roads and bridges authorized through LTAC. We'll have a presentation from LTAC later this session. That $322,000. So right now, you'll hear later today a presentation from Mr. Hibbard about the statewide cost allocation. Statewide cost allocation in broad brushstrokes is a look back over 2 years to allocate the costs from the expenditure for Deputy Attorney General funding specifically, and state controller fees and others, right? What the governor is proposing is that ITD needs some additional help with their legal counsel out there through the Deputy Attorney General. This proposal is to speed up or otherwise break SWICAP from its normal look-back period and start having ITD pay currently in fiscal year 2025. So that's why you're seeing an addition of $322,000 of revenue from the Highway and Roads Fund. $5 million for invasive species, $1 million for Soil and Water Conservation Commission. This is line 17. This is from the Business Information and Infrastructure Fund. This is otherwise known as where SWICAP revenues had been carved out to go. It expires in 2025, and so that diversion of revenues would no longer go to the Business Information Infrastructure Fund. This is the anticipated cash balance from the State Controller's Office of $2.1 million to bring back in there. And finally, a $24 million deposit in the Budget Stabilization Fund for a total general fund obligation of $604 million under the governor's proposal. That leaves total revenues at $5.5 billion if the legislature chooses to follow that plan exactly.
Mr. Bybee, question if I may. Co-Chair and I have talked about this during the last year on these transfers and reserves. In essence, these are expenses, but they're being treated as transfers somehow out of revenue. Is that kind of what we're hearing?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, historically we have treated on the general fund cash balance sheet a transfer out of the general fund to other funds as a revenue adjustment. Now, what I can tell you, spending some time with my colleagues from other states, specifically Colorado, is that their goal is to make sure that if it's going out of the general fund for spending, then they treat that as a general fund obligation. And so how Colorado would show these are general fund appropriations rather than revenue adjustment, so that everyone is getting a better sense of how much money is being sent out for spending. Now, I think you could argue that sending cash out of the general fund for rainy day funds isn't exactly appropriation for spending. So you're setting that aside into another account for savings. So it's a sort of process through these general fund revenue adjustments that you find in this section.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Could you do something for us and for the benefit of the committee and for transparency purposes? We want to make sure that anything that really appears to be an expense shows as an expense. Could you redo that for us on another sheet, next few days, whatever, showing these, like you say, the budget stabilization, if you look at accounting wise, that's an asset. It's transferred one place over to an asset, so it's not really an expense. But the others, to me, look like expenses. We would like to see what are those expenses added to the other expenses we already have under expenditures. I'm referring to the presentation we received yesterday, and see what the real percentage increase might be on expenses compared to the prior year. Could you do that for us?
Mr. Chairman,
And we can share that at another time with the committee.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add to that? Okay. I see, well, did you want to add something?
Mr. Co-Chair, Mr. Bybee, we would need to include in that other revenue adjustments as well that have been proposed, I believe. If we're going to do it, let's take it. Maybe you can break it out for us of revenue reductions versus transfers. But if we are going to do that, then I think it needs to be the whole picture, and we can at least have the information as a starting point. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what we would like to have. So thank you for that. And we look forward to receiving that. Is that Ms. Senator Cook?
Thank you. Wondering if you, Mr. Chair, or if Mr. Bybee could define transfer one more time for me, really slow.
Mr. Bybee, you want to give it a shot?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Cook. So the way that we have treated a transfer, this is otherwise known as taking available general fund revenue, that's what you see on line 7 of the sheet, and sending that to a different fund, right? So a different fund could be the rainy day fund, it could be set up for savings, right? It could be the budget stabilization fund. In the case of line 8, where we're sending that to is the fire suppression deficiency fund. And so that transfer is being sent to the fire suppression deficiency fund in order to pay for the cost of fighting fires in this state. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're identifying a revenue adjustment currently, and historically how we've done this is taking money out of the general fund and spending it from a different fund. So we're showing the expenditure from the fund in which it occurs, but treating it as an adjustment to revenue on the general fund cash reconciliation side.
Mr. Bybee, may I comment on that one? The budget stabilization, to me, looks like a movement into a reserve, into an asset that will be spent sometime in the future if we have to raid that fund. The transfer to the fire suppression deficiency fund, in essence, if we don't call this an expense now, it will never be considered an expense. Is that correct? We'll never see that again because it's just over there and then they'll spend it and it'll never be considered an expense. Is that right?
Really good clarification, Mr. Chairman. In fact, we would treat that under the dedicated column of expenditures at that point.
Yeah.
So we find it and we follow it, but it shows up rather than an expense of the general fund, it shows up as an expenditure of a dedicated fund at that point when we treat it that way.
And thank you for that. One of our concerns has been that we understand a dedicated fund. Let's say Fish and Game, for example. They get their fees from hunters, fishermen, that kind of thing. That's truly a dedicated kind of fund in our understanding. But if we're taking general fund money and sticking it somewhere else, and then we call it dedicated, that's a little bit of a concern. We want to make sure if we're really spending general fund money that we show it as general fund expenses. Be careful not to put it off to the side and then we never see it again, because we tend to focus on the general fund expenses. And we assume, at least I have in the past, that the dedicated fund is kind of something that generates its own revenue and generates its own expense. But when we're taking it from the general fund, I'm not sure that's really dedicated in my understanding what a dedicated fund ought to be. Any comment on that? You good with that?
Mr. Co-Chair, I agree. I think that is a great summary. And during COVID, we made many adjustments, including in the budgets. One of those is general fund reappropriation. On the previous line, was it 34 million, whatever that number was? The 73, it's in there with, anyway, we didn't used to do general fund reappropriation nearly to this extent, again, because it masks actual spending for that year. So one of the things the co-chair and I have really tried to do is align our numbers with our current year revenue. And so we have another thing that we have seen recently in an era of large surplus, admittedly, has been transfer those to dedicated funds. But general fund has been the source. And so we are striving to find ways to reflect that in ways that help all of us understand that, yes, we're dealing with a dedicated fund, but it came from the general fund versus fees that support, certain agencies. So yes, I think you will please give us your feedback. We know this is a concern to you as well. And so we will continue to look to find better ways to display that in our documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So this is an effort at increased transparency to make sure everybody understands really what the real revenues are and what all the expenses are. And so as we look at this, if we move these into expenses for our purposes, we understand that, then obviously the percentage increase over the prior year's budget is going to look a lot larger than what's been projected at this point. So that's what we're trying to do, is make sure we really understand how much are we really spending, what is the real percentage increase over the prior year. So go ahead, unless there's other questions. Is that Senator Hernan? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bybee, if I'd like an explanation as an example of where I would see a certain amount of money in these numbers, and that would be, I see the $330 million for public school support from House Bill 1 of 2022 back on the cash balances and revenues. But also from that same bill was $80 million for the Idaho Launch Program. So where do I see that number in all of these slides that we've been seeing?
Mr. Bybee.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Herndon, so the previous discussion with Senator Ward King was that we count those revenues as dedicated funds because they're being carved out before they hit the general fund. And so you would find the expenditure of those funds in the dedicated column. My colleague, Mr. Tatro, is going to cover that, the statewide general dedicated federal total fund report. And so you would see that in the $13.8 billion total Idaho state budget number.
Follow up.
Follow up. So the $80 million that is funding Idaho Launch, what is the source of that money?
Mr. Bybee.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Herndon, it is sales tax.
Follow up.
Follow up. So isn't this one example, though, of where we're missing a true revenue? If general fund is generally corporate and personal income taxes and sales taxes, and so this 80 million has just kind of disappeared off of these financial statements. That seems to be a little bit misleading as to actual state general fund revenues and expenses.
Thank you. Yeah, you'll like the next chart that's coming up here in a couple of minutes. We're going to talk about that very point. Thank you for raising that question. Mr. Tanner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 6, you have the total transfers in and out. I just cannot remember what you said that this one was versus the other one, the page 8, I believe it was. So these are both on revenues coming out, but why did you break them out completely separately from because there's still a transfer in a sense. Why are we breaking them out separately? So I understand.
Mr. Bybee. Did you follow that?
I think what I heard Representative Horman translate is the difference between the 746 that the 670 that you see on line 16 and the additional revenue reductions that you see on lines 4 and 5. Is that what we're describing here?
Mr. Tanner, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so if you'd go to page, I'm trying to look and see what your page number, you just said source from page 7, so I don't actually see on your, but it shows all the transfers. The one we were just on that showed all the transfers from DEQ to CAF, yes. So the total transfers out, both of them are, in a sense, looking at the revenue. Why are we looking at these in two different ways? I'm just trying to understand.
I'm with you.
Mr. Bybee, now we understand the question.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Tanner, sorry, and thank you for your patience with me on that one. So the difference between what you're seeing here as transfers or general fund obligations mean that these are appropriations that this committee would take up. Okay. The committee would take up these appropriations to, and the language from the appropriation bill is there's hereby authorized and the state controller shall transfer $17 million from the general fund to the fire suppression deficiency fund. When you talk about the let's just focus on TECM because I know that one a little bit better. So this is found in section 633638 Idaho Code. That is the section, the statute for the sales tax distribution formula. And so what it says in the sales tax distribution formula for TECM is that after transfers of 11.5% for revenue sharing, otherwise known as property tax relief, the tax commission shall distribute 4.5%. This is current law, 4.5% for the Transportation Expansion Congestion Mitigation Fund. So the difference between those two is one is driven by statute in Idaho Code, and the other one is driven by statute as an appropriation.
Thank you for the question, and I think the chart that's coming up will help everybody see what we're concerned about here too. So keep going, Mr. Bybee.
All right.
I don't see anybody else.
All right, so $5.5 billion of total revenues available in fiscal year 2025. Let's jump into the appropriation side of the equation or direct appropriation side of the equation. This first slide, we're going to talk about maintenance costs, right? So the maintenance part of the budget, which is benchmark 11, right? So line 30 equates to benchmark 11. We'll hear about that a little bit later. And so what you see on line 22, and I want to highlight this one specifically, right? So benefit cost changes. So in that benefit cost change number is the appropriation for employee group health insurance. There's also adjustments for PERSI and other things that are built into that number. But the net of what you see on the request side was based on when we built these budgets, we asked agencies to include an additional amount to hit that $14,450 per eligible employee. Just in broad brushstrokes here, that equates to a $10 million increase to the general fund, $10.6 million increase to the general fund. The governor's budget reduces that amount and more. The current level appropriation for health insurance is $13,750. The governor's budget reduces that amount down to $13,000 based on the Milliman report. Okay. The thing that I want to highlight here is that in the Milliman report itself is that Milliman cites that it developed certain models to estimate the values included in this report. The intent of the model was to estimate necessary funding levels for medical and dental programs for fiscal year 25 through 28. I'm quoting here. We've reviewed the models, including their inputs, calculations, and outputs for consistency, reasonableness, and appropriateness as intended, as the intended purpose and in compliance with general accepted accounting, actuarial practice, and relevant actuarial standards of practice. This is the key point for me, is the models rely on data and information as input to the models. We have relied upon certain data and information provided by the state of Idaho, BCI, and regents for this purpose and accepted it without audit. To the extent that the data and information provided is not accurate or is not complete, the values provided in this report may likewise be inaccurate or incomplete. I'm bringing this up to the committee to think about is that we have a brand new insurance provider that I know that you're all wrestling with right now. And what my team has been struggling for over this actuarial report is really to not just look at the short-term impact, which is reflected in the governor's budget, but what that long-term cost is actually going to look like. Is this short-term impact a one-time shot in the arm to revenue appropriations, or is it, and then what you see, as my experience has been, is on year 3, you see costs go through the roof to make up the difference, right? So the question is sustainability to me on this one. We haven't had a whole lot of time to digest it. I think this committee and the CEC committee is going to wrestle with this over the next few months and really try and understand the long-term implications of that appropriation amount that you see on line 22. The rest of the budget, what you see in those maintenance costs include things for inflationary adjustments, replacement items, CEC. CEC can be combined on lines 26 through 28. Ms. Otto is going to talk about that later. Total maintenance budget as proposed is a $5.15 billion budget, 5.17 under current law.
Mr. Bybee, may I make a comment? If you're ready to go to the next page, I want to comment on this, if I may. So you've heard us talk about maintenance budgets and passing 10 maintenance budgets, which are these functional areas. We'll make sure we're all together here for just a second. Got a conversation going on. Those conversations can be very important, so I'm not trying to discredit the conversation. Okay. This is kind of your first blush at what we're talking about with maintenance budgets. And we're going to hear the detail of that on Friday as we start going through this. But this lets you see some of the things that we considered were, you see the base budget at the top, and then you see benefits. And are you planning to go through each of these additional items, or have you kind of given it the broad brush and we're moving on?
Mr. Chairman, my remarks have concluded for this.
Okay, thank you. I thought they had. So these are the items that co-chair and I, and with Mr. Bybee and the staff, have looked at. What do we feel are the things that are absolutely, basically we have to have them to keep the lights on and the doors open, in addition to the base. There are certain things that are happening. And so you will see those listed here. You may see some minor modifications as we get into each of the 10 major maintenance budgets. But this gives you kind of an overview of some of the things that we considered as the base and the I'll call them non-discretionary. I mean, we can't really do anything about it. These are contracts that we have to honor, the benefit changes, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things that are required to happen. But I do have a question for you, Mr. Bybee. Replacement items for that 11 million. Remind us why that would be considered in the maintenance. What is that replacement item?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer the specifics that are in the
Okay,
replacement.
all right,
items.
don't worry about it at this point, because my understanding was we were not having replacement items in there, but there may be something that's required here. Yeah, go ahead, you have a comment on it?
Thank you. I would just add, our budget staff has worked really hard to get us to the point where we can identify these maintenance things in different ways. Essentially, this is the statewide decisions we've made in the past, displayed in a different format, in a way that shows the actual true base or maintenance without enhancements. So while we didn't quite get it into the LBB, you will be provided, and the public, a separate document that will show the agency request, the governor's recommendation, and then a maintenance. So on that document is where you will see the replacement items as a 0. You will see the line items as a 0. So then you can begin to look at those percentages and measure the impact of our decisions above maintenance. So that will be a separate document provided on each agency, each budget that our staff has worked really hard to put together and is still working really hard to put together. The benefit changes, we will remain agnostic in this committee to any potential dispute. There is an executed contract right now, and but the numbers we put in here will be the numbers that will work for however that, if there is a dispute on this, however that resolves itself. So we're going to stay out of that crossfire. We'll just put a number in that will work for whatever resolution or contractual decision is made. Thank you.
I'll give you another example. We're kind of deviating a bit, so I won't hold you up here. But on CEC, for example, in the past, there's been a 1% hold number, and we're waiting for the CEC committee and our good friend, Senator Cook, and others that are serving on that committee. So you'll see a hold in some of the things that we have waiting for your input as to what you want the real CEC to be. So these are kind of the base that we've determined that we will start with in maintenance, and you'll hear more about this on Friday. Let's move ahead, please. Thank you. Mr. Bybee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman and members of the committee. So nearly wrapping up with the wall of numbers approach to this budget, and I have a few more things to talk about as we finish up here. So this is, again, a high-level look at all of the line items recommended and requested by the agencies by functional area. So education coming in at a $208 million in total line item. So that's going to include public schools and all the agencies that reside under the State Board of Education. You see Health and Human Services growth at $13.3 million on the general fund, and the governor's budget is a reduction of $61.5 million. And then you can see follow along there. So what you see is appropriation levels at $5.4 billion under the request and current law, $5.3 billion under the governor's proposal. All of these things together, what you look at is, let's focus on line 7. You can take my word for it. The top part of the sheet is the cash reconciliation on the revenue side of the equation, but I'm happy to go back and relive those numbers with you. The maintenance increase on the request side of the equation is a 0.6% increase over the original appropriation. The budget enhancements in total is a 4.9% increase. In total, it's a 4.8% budget request from the agencies. Now, looking at the governor's column, the reduction of from 0.6 to 0.2% or 0.2% is mostly driven by those benefit cost adjustments that I was just talking about, okay? And then the 2.8 down from a 4.9, what you're seeing is the impact of changing who the payer is in Medicaid specifically. All told, the governor's budget's at 2.2%, leaving an ending balance of $265 million. But if you look at the current request total and current law, there's, at least under our current forecast, there is some additional money to play with there, $655 million if the legislature chooses to go a different route. So you have some flexibility to move around in this budget. Takeaway number one. All right, let's talk about Medicaid for a minute before we move on. What I have on the screen here is right from the LBB page, the budget book page for the Division of Medicaid. And what you see here is the comparative summary of the agency request versus the governor's recommendation for Medicaid spending. Now, the first line that I want to highlight for you is down just below the middle of the page, and it's a little fuzzy on this screenshot, so I apologize for that. A lot of information here. But just below that on line 9 is where you see a request for an increased hospital assessment. Now, you remember back at JFAC tour when we talked about how the agency, through Section 10 of the appropriation bill, that's House Bill 369, if the agency was going to propose a new hospital assessment in this case, or an adjustment to benefits paid or some other mechanics, that they are not allowed to reflect that in the budget request. And so what you see that, the effect of that is expected costs on the general fund are at 7.8% under the agency request column from the general fund. Total costs, it's basically flat, 0.7%. Total budget is $4.7 billion from that hospital assessment deal. Now, when you look at the governor's recommendation, the governor isn't saying that we're going to change the budget, we're not going to change who's paying for, we're not going to change the dollar amount of what's being requested. All we're changing is who's paying for it. In this case, it's going to be shifted to the hospitals. And the things that I need to identify for this committee, the first hospital assessment that was passed in 2022, that was with Senate Bill 1350. We don't have any evidence back from the hospitals of what the impact actually is, how that has affected their bottom line, what's happening on that front. We will get that first data report back in March. And so what we're seeing here is an increased cost, another increased cost of about the same amount. So we passed a bill in 2022 that was a shift of $66 million from the general fund to a different payer. Total costs remain the same, right? And so here we have another proposal that's shifting it to a different payer. But as you'll note on the total budget, we have a governor's appropriation request of $4.698 billion. The difference between those two numbers is $15 million, which is another shift of who the payer is, onto the Millennium Fund. Now, the Millennium Fund is taking a serious look at this and really trying to understand the impact on that one. So the point of all this is that our budget drivers are population-driven. Medicaid is population-driven, who the user is. School support is population-driven, how many kids are in the classroom. Corrections, population-driven, who's in there. Those are our big budget drivers here. And what this budget is reflective of is a shift of who the payer is, not of actual costs. And so what you see is a 2.2% budget as reflected by the governor, but if you were to change that onto the general fund, it turns it into a 4.4, just like that. And so a little bit of explaining on this chart here. So what you see is a double pie chart here. And the biggest piece that you don't see in the smaller pie chart, which is reflective of the governor's budget growth, is the gold. You're seeing the Health and Human Services picked up on that one. Changes it from a $114 million budget increase to a 230, effectively doubles the general fund increase if we're not willing to shift the payer. Now, those policy discussions are going to develop over the course of the session, and we're not taking a stand on whether that's good or bad policy, but it has the effect of letting the legislature, again, getting all of the blame and none of the credit on how these budgets end up showing up.
Mr. Bybee, can you go back to the prior page and let me just reiterate what you just said? I want to make sure everybody understands that. Policy bills, a lot of the things that are being proposed in the governor's state of the state address are policy bills. This is not a policy committee. That's the purview of the germane committee. So that 58 million, somebody will probably run a bill that will address that. And then those germane committees will deal with that. It'll come out to the floor if it does. And if legislature passes it, governor signs it, then we know what we can do. And so I've reiterated to leadership, we're hopeful that leadership, working with the chairs of different committees, will move things along quickly, because it makes it difficult for us to finalize a budget if we don't know what the policy bills are. So it's not our role here in JFAC to debate policy bills, yay or nay. We'll accept whatever policy bills come, and then we can debate what we do with them after that, okay? Any questions? I see a light. Is that Mr. Tanner, Representative?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on that. So the hospital assessment, going back and reading the actual bill, I don't think it actually stated a percent. It just created the fund itself. I'm just curious, do we have to go, is that, so on that I'm curious, is that something that's done in JFAC then, or is it, the hospital assessment is actually already created in a sense, but what we're charging them, in a sense, what percentage we're kicking back, making them front out, is that something that would have to get done with policy, or is that something that just gets done here?
I'll just comment on that if I may. That's going to be a policy bill. Something's going to happen to change that, because right now there's a statute that says X. As you were saying, there's a certain percent that the hospitals are picking up. And if that percent is to change, that's a policy bill. And we will not take that up here. We'll wait and see if a policy bill comes to us and how we deal with it. Am I correct, Mr. Bybee?
Mr. Chairman, 100%.
Any other questions? I don't see any. Let's move on then, please.
Okay. The other thing that I need to point out on this chart here is inclusive is another education line item. This is a proposal from Superintendent Ibarra for outcomes-based funding, about a $40 million. Just to state,
I think we have a different superintendent now.
Oh my goodness, Superintendent Critchfield.
It's okay. Thank you, Mr. Bybee.
There's a lot going on today. Thank you very much for the clarification. Superintendent Critchfield, I do apologize. There was a request for $40 million ongoing for outcomes-based funding. In the governor's budget, you have a shift onto a dedicated fund with a one-time fund source. So onto the bond levy equalization fund. It has a $60 million cash fund, so effectively you could fund 1.5 years of that program, but after that, it's a cost that could fall into the general fund, okay? So that's what's also included to get to that 4.4% budget.
In other words, another policy bill. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I believe the superintendent is running a policy bill for that outcomes-based funding. I'm
Okay.
using a little bit of a weenie word there because I don't know specifically, but,
Yeah.
but I think that is the plan.
Okay. Thank you. Again, we'll just wait and see what happens, right? That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Jared's giving me a thumbs up. Yes. All right. A couple more slides, things to go over. So as we've been going through this discussion about sales tax revenues and general fund revenues and what's going on with the total budget, you all are aware of the little chart that I was showing that showed the amount of tax relief and earmarks on top of that tax relief. And what we're talking about earmarks here is sales tax that are earmarked for a specific purpose, right? When I was showing that chart. But over the weekend, when I was preparing for this discussion, I had a little bit of a lightning bolt, thanks to Madam Chairman and Ms. Phipps downstairs, and I kind of put a few thoughts together. And I think this chart expresses and explains what I've been trying to describe for a year now, is where the sales tax revenue is actually going, what percentage is being used for the general fund. So what it shows is the bars in that purpley plum color up there. By the way, I hope Senator Cook can see some of these colors. We worked really hard over the summer to try and get these things lined out so that We had colors that folks that had visual impairment, like color blindness, could see the differences here. I'm not sure we hit quite the mark according to Senator Cook yesterday, but we're trying really hard to be accommodating on that one. So that purplish color, the big bar on the bottom in the far left-hand side of the page under 2008, that was what our sales tax distribution formula looked like in 2008. And I picked 2008 because that was the amount the year right before the Great Recession, right? And so back then we had about 86% of sales tax going to the general fund. And that's important because the sales tax is our one tax type that is our least volatile. That is something that we rely on when times get tough, when the stock market's down, when income taxes go down, to help carry us through and maybe not have to make the cuts as deep as we need to, or even consider a revenue increase bill, right? Back then, you see a sliver, it's only about 1% of the budget. That was our first round of earmarks of the sales tax. That's $4.8 million for the Water Pollution Control Fund, $5 million for the Permanent Building Fund. Very small amount back then. By the way, those static numbers haven't changed over time. Those amounts remain, the 4.8 and the 5. So about $10 million from sales tax revenues going to those two small programs. And then the green bar at the top of that 2008 one is what I'm calling property tax relief. Now these are distributions for the 11.5% that goes out to revenue sharing, and back then it included amounts for the circuit breaker program and the agricultural personal property tax relief bill, okay? Fast forward to fiscal year 2022, what you see is that growth in the state spending or earmarked for state spending, that's all related to the TECM program. That's that 4.5% that we've carved out for transportation in order to help, build the roads and build the infrastructure. The property tax proportion went down a little bit by then, but it was still effectively the same, and we even added some additional that went out for the personal property tax back then. So, and also in that year, you're starting to see about 6.4% of sales tax revenues going out for the tax relief fund. Ooh, I forgot my flow chart to prepare. I've got it handy though. All right, so fast forward to fiscal year 2024 in House Bill 1. So this is current law under fiscal year 2024. What you see is about 60% projections going to the general fund, 18% going for dedicated state spending, 16.2% for property tax relief. That includes the impact of House Bill 292. And then, the tax relief fund is still kind of staying consistent. And then the chart on the far right, I guess I'm glad that I picked it to look like it's snowing to help kind of differentiate the color on this snowy morning, but that is the governor's proposal for the additional $175 million coming out of the sales tax. General fund would receive 55% under that scenario. And so coming back to some of the remarks that I was making earlier, sustainability of the budget, ability to adapt, ability to address it. What we've done, or if you go down with this proposal, is you've tied up almost 40% of sales tax distribution, our most stable and functional revenue source to get us through recessions, with other spending and other programs. And the problem becomes are your savings amounts enough to carry the day? Is that 15% in the budget stabilization fund enough to carry the day now, right? Or does that number need to be higher to adjust for this additional volatility we're introducing into our revenue stream? Does this mean that we can no longer pay for growth in Medicaid, in corrections, in public school support? It's tough. It's a big question. This legislature has a lot to wrestle with this year.
Mr. Bybee, comment on your budget stabilization fund. You may recall, committee, that that is capped at 15%, and you heard Mr. Adams yesterday talk about how as the revenues come down, that percentage, obviously, the dollar amount related to that 15% goes down. And so we may want to look at, somebody may want to look at an increase in taking off that lid, at least, and allow it to move somehow with the overall revenue, particularly as we see the sales tax amount going down. That's something to think about. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, please. I can't even see your light from here. There you go. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bybee, when the revenues decrease and the percentage goes down, does money come out of the fund? And if so, where does that money go?
Mr. Bybee, Mr. Adams explained that yesterday. Do you want to give another shot at that, please, Mr. Bybee?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Furness, so all of those distributions are statutorily designed, right? So if you're stating a dollar amount, so back in 2008, when we just had a flat dollar amount for the permanent building fund at $5 million, or $4.8 million for the water pollution control fund, that stays the same. And so that affects how much money, so if revenues go down, that affects how much money is available for the general fund after all said and done. And so now what we have in current law, we have another $410 million that comes out before it hits the general fund. So those programs are going to get, another way to say that, those programs are going to get their cut of dollars first, and then the general fund ends up with whatever's left over.
May I add something to that? The co-chair, and I think part of your question, you were talking about the budget stabilization fund, is that correct? Okay. So the percentage is fixed. It's a 15% max that we could have. So as the revenue comes down, the percentage remains the same, 15%, but the dollar amount goes down. What happens with we have to move it out of the budget stabilization. It goes into the general fund, to answer your question. And then we look at the next year's revenue, and it may go back up. And that's what Mr. Adams was projecting yesterday, is we have some that likely will have to be decreased in 24, come back in 25, and the net, as I recall, was about a $24 million increase in 25. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Apparently I'm using a Congress trick of answering the question I want to answer rather than the question that was asked. All right. Just a recheck of where we are on the rainy day fund balances as of today, $880
I'm sorry,
million.
we have another question. Senator Herman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, before we proceed from this nice, pretty chart, Mr. Bybee, can you explain all these different colors? Let's just take FY24 and the 59.3%. So the 18% to state spending, 16.2% to property tax relief, et cetera. Is that the other colors besides the purple? Is that something that we're seeing in all the other tables of general fund spending, or are these other colors examples of things that get diverted before we examine general fund?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Bybee.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Herndon, it's the latter. So the examination of the general fund begins with the 59.3% of the purple.
Thank you. Proceed. Mr. Bybee.
All right, wrapping up here. General fund, budget stabilization fund balances. This is current balance, not projected balance, $880 million at its current statutory cap. Education rainy day fund, otherwise known as Public Education Stabilization Fund. The balance as of last night at 1:15 a.m., according to Mr. Whitworth, is $235 million. It's 233 as of earlier this fall. So, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, that concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Bybee. Any questions for Mr. Bybee before we let him off the hook here? It looks like we're good to go. Let's go ahead and take a break right now. It's a little difficult to tell where we are on this time frame since we're starting at a half hour instead, but we're figuring it out during the break. So let's take a 10-minute break. Let's get back at 5 till the hour. And with that, we are on break. Recess.
Hardware and closed captioning for Idaho in Session is provided by the Idaho Legislature and Idaho Legislative Services Office. Additional funding is provided by the Idaho Public Television Endowment.
Welcome back. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Bybee, you're on again, it looks like. Are you doing the statutes related to the budget, correct? Think we could,
Give me a break.
think we could whip through that in about 10 minutes or so?
I will definitely do that.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that.
Okay. Members of the committee, hi again. Keith Bybee, I'm the manager of budget policy analysis. This presentation should be review from last year. In fact, they're the exact same slides. I just updated the 23 to a 24 on this slide is all that's changed from last year, okay? So first, I'm going to skip the brief history of budgeting in Idaho and focus on the germane statutes related to the budget and JFAC expressly. So section JFAC is found in section 67-432 Idaho Code. It's hereby created and consists of the members of Senate Finance and the members of House Appropriations. 67-433 outlines the rules of procedure. It says Senate Finance during the interim, or excuse me, JFAC during the interim is not, and when the legislature is not in session, shall adopt rules of procedure. Committee may create, such subcommittees which may include other members of the legislature as may be necessary for the performance of its duties. Committee shall function during legislative sessions and during the interim between sessions. Committee shall meet as often as may be necessary for the proper performance of its duties upon the call of the co-chairs. 435, powers and duties. Powers and duties include to review executive budget and budget requests of each state department, agency, and institution, including requests for construction of capital improvements as well as other requests for appropriations submitted to the legislature, conduct hearings as it may deem necessary and proper, submit a report to each session of the legislature covering its activities during the preceding period and setting forth its findings and recommendations, to make such recommendations to the Appropriation Legislative Committee as it may deem proper, and perform other duties as legislative council may appropriate, resolution, direct. Continued, we have pieces about how audit findings are released. All reports produced by the Legislative Audits Division shall be delivered to the co-chairs for their review and approval prior to release. Co-chairs, at their discretion, conduct hearings related to any report and seek input and testimony prior to or after reports. This has been a year of studying audits and really expressing its power and duty as a committee. We've had several historic looks at audit findings and review hearings and oversight hearings. Pretty impressive year for a brand new committee. Other statutory provisions related to JFAC, 67-437, that's state governments required to submit reports of actual and estimated receipts and expenditures to DFM and LSO. You have the authority to examine and inspect all properties, equipment, and facilities. We did some of that this fall. You get to enforce subpoenas and compel witnesses to testify. 67-440, witnesses other than state officials that are compelled can be reimbursed for their costs borne to travel. So hopefully we don't get there. The biggest functions in Chapter 35, Title 67 are about the state budget. I'm going to blow through most of this stuff and focus on 13. So the Standing Committee of the House of Representatives and of the Senate in charge of appropriation measures shall sit jointly in open session while considering the budget. Committee may resolve itself into executive session. We did that. A lot of historic things that are found in statute, right, this year. The administrator of the Division of Financial Management or his designated representative shall attend all meetings of the joint committee and shall present to the committee that recommendations of the governor for amounts to be appropriated for each department, office, institution, including elected officers and the State Board of Education. Such presentation to include all information necessary to substantiate recommendations of the governor. The joint committee at its discretion may cause the attendance of heads or responsible representatives of said department, offices, institutions, and the joint committee may increase or decrease items in the budget as it may deem to be in the interests of greater economy and efficiency in public service. Continued by no later than January 15th of each year, that's Monday, the administrator of the Division of Financial Management shall report to the Joint Committee the following minimal information: a list by department, program, by funding source of all permanent positions authorized as of January 1 of the year, the current salary established for each position as of January 1. The list shall also designate which of the listed positions were vacant as of January 1 and the date such position became vacant. A list by department, program, and by funding source of the amounts needed to fund the state employee compensation changes being recommended by the governor, which list must be prepared to show the individual cost of each component of the compensation changes, and a report that complies and summarizes with the information the Division of Financial Management received in accordance with Section 67-1917 Idaho Code and 67-35021E Idaho Code. Now, appropriation bills are to be prepared by the Joint Committee. You get to choose the manner in which they're prepared and how they look. And that's it.
That's only 7 minutes. Any questions for Mr. Ivey? You went through that pretty quickly. Looks like Senator Lint. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And not necessarily a question, but we're looking at this in a different way, seems to me, a little bit this year. So trying to understand that. I'm wondering if we can maybe draw on or ask Alex to come forward, the director to come forward, and maybe bring some clarity between our discussion today and the structural balance discussion that we had yesterday, to see if we can kind of understand how they line up.
Mr. Bybee, do you want to do? Mr. Are you prepared to do that? Would you rather do it tomorrow? What would be your preference?
I can make a brief comment today, depending on.
Go ahead. Mr. Bybee, you defer to our good friend, Mr. Adams, if you want to make your comment, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Len, I believe the numbers that Mr. Bybee presented today are one and the same with what we presented yesterday. I would say the primary difference between what I saw today and yesterday is the breakout of the one-time and the ongoing. So, our budget that we showed yesterday, this one pager, and I do have additional copies if anyone needs one throughout. It shows the transfers, it shows the revenue reductions, and certainly you can recalculate anything you want to make any percentage you want. I do think I will quote the good co-chair from last year and say, don't look at the percentages, look at the bottom line. So the bottom line is $265 million of balance, most of it on the ongoing side of that equation. So I'd ask you to keep your North Star throughout the session is what is that ongoing ending balance? That ongoing ending balance, regardless of if it's an expenditure, regardless if it's a transfer, regardless if it's a revenue reduction, they are all one and the same. What is your structural balance at the end of the year? The budget that we presented to you is structurally balanced. It is structurally balanced through fiscal year 28. And I challenge you to bring forth a budget at the end of the session that does the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. I appreciate that. And I've told Mr. Adams personally how much I appreciate this, because it's a very helpful visual to see how much is a one-time hit and how much is ongoing. So I hope you keep that handy as we go through this session. Thank you, Mr. Adams. Appreciate it. Keith, anything else? Any other questions for Mr. Bybee? Okay, if not, thank you. Let's move to Ms. Jessup. Please identify yourself for the record when you are ready and proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Janet Jessup. I'm the Budget and Policy Analyst for Legislative Services, and I'm here to provide a
maybe this in more context of like, there's a bunch of decision units, individual decision.
Now we hear you better. Thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead.
my apologies, and thank you to Keith, making sure I stay on the straight and narrow. Those individual decision units or building blocks that go together and make up the eventual budget for an agency. And this is on page 5 of your budget, of your legislative budget book. And we're just going to be walking through that page. So this is the page as it appears in your legislative budget book. And if you look at benchmark 1, +2, +3, +4, eventually gets us to benchmark 6. And we're just going to be walking through those one benchmark at a time and highlighting some of the what's changing between those benchmarks. So if we start off at benchmark 1 is our original appropriation. So when we're building the fiscal year 25 budget, we start with what was appropriated in fiscal year 24. And what actions were taken by the legislature the last time you were here in Boise. And this original appropriation is inclusive of all of the appropriations that were passed that affect an agency, whether those appropriation bills were supplementals, they were for the agency as a whole, whether they were transfers, whether they were trailer bills as the result of germane legislation. They all filter into and inform that original appropriation. Now, between benchmarks 1 and 2, between original appropriation and total appropriation, we're taking into account reappropriation, where there are additional monies from the previous fiscal year that were brought into the current fiscal year as a result of legislatively allowed reappropriation. A supplemental appropriation for this year. So this year, in some of the budgets you may work, you may see some fiscal year 2024 supplementals. Those also get factored into what the total appropriation is, as does the board examiner actions or other deficiency fund warrants, etc. And those feed into your total appropriation. Once we get to the total appropriation, this is, so the original appropriation plus any of those changes, and then between benchmarks 2 and 3, so between the total appropriation and estimated expenditures, there's an opportunity for the agency to account for any adjustments that may be taking place. And sometimes those adjustments show up very clearly in reports, and sometimes they get a little bit lost in the detail. The details get lost. Some things that you may not see in reports is if an agency says, well, we were planning on using this $50,000 for operating expenditures, but we're going to end up using it for capital outlay. Those are expenditure adjustments that are being made by the agency between those two benchmarks. And if you have questions about those, your analyst should be able to walk you through those. Between benchmark 3, so the estimated expenditures in the base, we also have base adjustments. So you'll remember the base of the budget is that portion of the budget which is ongoing. So between benchmark 3 and 4, what you'll see in your reports, in your legislative budget book reports, is a lot of, in many cases, a negative number, because we're backing out all of those one-time amounts, all of those one-time expenditures that don't feed into the base appropriation, that ongoing base for an agency. Once we get to the base, so benchmark 4, the base is a major benchmark in our appropriations process. It is, again, kind of starting from the cleanest slate and looking back over what was done last year, but then what changes does the legislature want to make moving forward? And the first places you're going to see those changes made is between benchmarks 4 and 5, and this was referenced, I know, earlier in some of the other one of the other presentations when we're looking at things like benefit cost, inflationary adjustments, statewide cost allocation, annualizations, CEC. But also what falls within this section is if there's adjustments to endowment, if there's non-discretionary adjustments for schools, for corrections, for higher education, those are also adjustments that you're going to be seeing between the base and the maintenance of current operation reports that you currently have in your legislative budget book. And some of those are preset and prescribed to agencies. So when you're looking at the agency request and they only have a 1% CEC, that is because in pursuance of the Budget Development Manual, which is a guidance document which is developed by the Legislative Services and Division of Financial Management to guide agencies in making their request, agencies are directed to only put in a placeholder of 1% CEC. I know I've had discussions before where it's like, well, why does the agency only want 1% CEC for its employees? That is not what that is reflective of. When you see that 1% CEC in the agency request, that is because that is the amount that is prescribed in the Budget Development Manual. Similarly, all the agencies are requesting the same amounts for benefit costs. That's because that is the amount that is prescribed that they put in their request in the Budget Development Manual. Starting from benchmark 5, I don't want to go too quickly if there's any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Here's your chance. This is getting into a little bit of what we talked about with the maintenance budget, the base, and what are the things that would be added to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you just go over inflationary adjustments a little bit more in detail?
Thank you. Ms. Jessup.
Mr. Chair, Senator, my pleasure. So inflationary adjustments are effectively broken out into two different categories within your budget. You may see references in the legislative budget book write-ups to general inflation, and you see references to contract inflation. So I'm going to take up the latter first because it's a little bit more straightforward. We have agencies that may be in contracts, maybe they're service contracts, or they are leasing space for where their offices are located, and those contracts may have cost escalation built into them. And so the agency is coming and saying, we need $1,000 more this year because our rent in Coeur d'Alene is going up. Okay, that's contract inflation. You also have general inflation, which captures what are the increased costs for their operations. And that varies greatly depending on the agency. For an agency like Idaho State Patrol, that spends a lot of time on the road, they may be saying, look, gas prices are going up, and that is inflating our cost of operations. So, and what exactly those breakouts are in each individual budget write-up within the legislative budget book, our analysts have tried to identify what those major cost drivers are for general inflation are, because they do vary from agency to agency, depending on what the agency is doing.
Follow up, or are you good? That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Jessup. Other questions? Don't see any. Go ahead, please.
Moving on to between benchmark 5 and benchmark 6, this is where we see line items or enhancements that are occurring to the budget. So these are things that are different than what we see above the maintenance line. What we see above the maintenance line is these are the adjustments or the enhancements that we're looking for to keep doing what we're currently doing as an agency. What we see after that benchmark 5 is these are either desired or needed enhancements above and beyond that. And again, there are write-ups that are included in your legislative budget book that seek to not only identify some of the specific aspects of what those requests may be, how much in personnel, how much in operating, how much, it's like, who are they hiring, what pay grade, but also just explaining what is the need that is being expressed by the agency. Also within this section, within your report, you're going to see reference to budget law exemptions, and these can vary greatly from agency to agency. In some cases, agencies may request the ability to move funds from different account categories. They may request reappropriation authority for the next year. Those are all individual requests. They vary by agency and are outlined in your legislative budget book. And that gets us to our original appropriation, and then that becomes our starting point. So our original appropriation for fiscal year 25 will then become the original appropriation for 26.
Excuse me, Senator Cook, questions?
Sorry for interrupting, but
no, thank you.
Question back on benchmark 5. I just wanted to make sure with the co-chairs, if I understood this right. So the totals for benchmark 5 will be our maintenance budget, and that's what we'll be passing on the first 10 budgets, is the maintenance of benchmark 5.
Yes, thank you, Senator Cook. I was going to make that same statement right before she changed the page. So I'm glad you caught it, and I hope everybody else understands that is the maintenance of current operations. Those are the 10 budgets we're going to be passing. And then after that, we'll begin to look at these line items and all of the requests that departments have in addition to the base operation. Thank you for clarifying that. Go ahead.
So again, though benchmark 6 becomes benchmark 1, and it repeats a happy little cycle. And so again, going back to what we started with, I just wanted to point this out and what does it look like in the actual reports that you're seeing in the legislative budget book. So you can see, and the benefit of once you understand the budget, the decision unit model, it repeats in pretty much all our reports. You're going to see, this is a comparative summary for Department of Agriculture this year. You can see where we start with the original appropriation from last year. They have a deficiency warrant, and so that feeds into what their total appropriation is. You can see between 3 and 4, those negative amounts, those one-time amounts coming out of the budget before the base is set. You can see those maintenance adjustments being made between the base and program maintenance, between those benchmarks 4 and 5, and then of course line items. Similarly, if you ask one of our analysts for our handy-dandy Gen-Dead Fed reports, and before I go on, I think that there's a question.
Thank you. Senator Ward Engel King.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I guess I have a question. So we're going to actually be looking at and passing these budgets twice. We'll pass a maintenance budget, then we'll come back and look at their line items and their requests, and then pass that portion of the budget too. So we're going to be doing every budget twice. I think I'm missing something, or maybe I'm behind here.
Thank you. Appreciate the question. Let me respond to that if I may. We will be passing the maintenance budgets, and underneath that, as you recall, we have lots of different agencies and departments under each of those functional areas. So we'll pass the maintenance budget. That'll make sure that no matter whatever else happens on line items or any other requests, the function of all of these departments and agencies keep moving ahead. If you remember, we've got about 23 budgets that haven't asked for anything. And so we will have 23 budgets that we won't even have to do this year. Where in the past, we always had to do each of those individually and carry them to the floor. So there's a net improvement in the number of bills that we're going to be doing. Anything you'd like to add to that, Co-Chair? Okay. Thank you for the question. Go ahead.
So if we were to look at the Gen-Dead Fed or a general dedicated federal breakdown for your agencies, you again see the DU model of these 6 different benchmarks repeat itself. And you'll see that in a lot of statewide reports that may be in your front end. Again, if you have any questions about what's going on in individual lines or between these different benchmarks, your analyst will be able to provide some additional information if that is what you seek. But Mr. Chairman, that's all that I had for this morning. If there's any questions, I would stand for them.
Thank you, Ms. Jessup. We appreciate that. Any further questions for Ms. Jessup? Seeing none, let's move ahead. Thank you. Next on our agenda, we have Mr. Tetro. If you'd come forward, please, and identify yourself for the record. And proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jared Tatro, the Deputy Manager for the Budget and Policy Division. Can you hear me okay? All right. Today I'm just going to do a pretty quick overview on the legislative budget book. Just a reminder of how we read it all. Some of the presentations today have covered quite a bit of what I was going to go over, so this should go pretty smooth. State government structure, piece 1. Article 2, Section 1 of the Idaho State Constitution outlines the 3 branches of government. The first and the best branch, the legislative department, then the executive branch, then judicial branch. Article 4, Section 20 of the state constitution, it limits the number of our executive departments to 20. But as you know, we have more than 20 agencies throughout the state, or we'd have some pretty big agencies. To do this, we have a couple big departments called self-governing agencies and Office of the Governor. And on page 22 of your budget book, you're going to see this exact same chart. So anyone following along or wanting to look in their book or in SharePoint, you're going to see the same table. Here's where you're going to see on the left, you're going to see our constitutional officers, from the governor to the superintendent of public instruction and everything in between. Then you see those 20 boxes in the middle. Box 18, Department of Self-Governing Agencies. I know it's on there somewhere. Where's the Office of the Governor? Yeah, it's on there somewhere. Anyways, this is how we get around, I don't want to say get around, this is how we meet the constitutional requirement and not violate the 20 agencies. What you're going to find is every agency is going to fall within one of those boxes. So, for example, Department of Agriculture. We have the Soil and Water Conservation Commission and the Department of Agriculture. That's done, it's 2 agencies, but it's done in 2 appropriation bills. But when you look in your budget book, you go to the Department of Ag, and from there you'll find the 2 different requests. For Idaho State Police, you're going to find 4 divisions, or 4, we'll call them 4 separate agencies: Brand Inspection, State Police, Post, and the Racing Commission. This committee has decided to place all 4 of those into one appropriation bill. 67-35-14 allows this committee to decide how those appropriation bills are laid out. Continuing on, self-governing agencies. I have 9/10 divisions, and I know Mr. Hibbert will get into this when we get into the public defense, state appellate public defender, office of state public defender, and we kind of have 2 right now as they're transitioning. Last year legislation was passed, and so if you look in the budget book, you will see 10, but moving forward, you'll only see 9 appropriation bills. And so under that Department of Self-Governing, that's where you're going to find the Hispanic Affairs Commission, the Historical Society, the Lottery, Public Defense, Veteran Services, and occupational licenses. Those individual agencies all fall under that Department of Self-Governing Agencies. And then they all receive their own, well, historically they've received their own appropriation bill. We'll see how things move forward. Any questions so far on how state government is laid out? Pretty straightforward stuff.
Just a comment, if I may. So as you see these 20, that helps give you a little comfort on the 10 that we've contracted that down to for our maintenance budgets. We could have gone with the 20, but we felt some of these we could combine into functional areas rather than separate departments. So we're fine to go ahead and combine them into the 10 maintenance budgets that you'll see. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the agencies under the Office of the Governor, so drug policy, arts, and liquor and others, they're located under the box within titled Governor. So the state budget structure, what I'm going to go over today, we're going to keep this very high level. What you have is basically you have 2 requests made of the legislature. You have a request made by every agency saying, legislature, here's what we think we need, here's what we would like. We want you to consider our request that's before you. Then you have the governor's recommendation, which is the governor's request of the legislature, where the governor says, here's what I think state agencies need. Legislature, please consider my recommendation. And this is done, as Mr. Bobby went over earlier today, basically in 3 different types of funds. You have general funds, federal funds, and everything else by definition is a dedicated fund. So as the good chairman pointed out, some of those are dedicated with revenue, fishing licenses. Some of those could be a miscellaneous revenue fund, which is dedicated, but it just has to fit somewhere. It's not general and it's not federal. That keeps everything kind of in a simple conversation. So when you get to those dedicated funds, and there's about 300 of them, if I remember correctly, you just got to look at that fiscal source book, that publication that we provide on our website, as well as in every deep dive presentation you'll be seeing moving forward, to see the source and the use of every one of those funds. So we take all of that information, and in that budget book, we break it out into technically 8 sections. Section 0 is what we call the front end. Those are those statewide reports, and I'll go over a couple of them here in a minute, that look at the entire state budget kind of in one page at a time. What is the entire compilation of agency requests? What is the entire submitted governor's recommendation? What is health insurance in more detail and how that impacts every single agency? What analyst do I go find to ask about a budget? That's the front end. That's where you're going to find that kind of high-level information. Then we have our 6 functional areas: education, health, safety, etc. When you're looking at that book and you see paged at the bottom, 1- whatever it is, that means you're in education. 2- you're in health, etc. So that way you always know when you're looking at those budget book pages and go, Hispanic Committee, oh, it's 5- they're in economic development. And then section 7 is a 4-page glossary to just give you some terms. These are the functional areas that we've always kind of followed between the governor's office, LSO, and this committee to just kind of keep track of agencies in a basic premise of where they fall within the structure of government. We can make arguments that some should move here, some should move there, but as a basic premise, this is kind of how it falls out. Any questions so far? Are we doing okay?
Any questions from the committee?
Okay.
Seeing none, let's go ahead.
So now that we have our foundation, we have our front-end reports. Again, staff assignments, high-level reports on revenues, appropriations, expenditures, deficiency warrants, CEC, 22-year history of the general fund as a dollar, as a percentage, how did it change? Major reserve balances, budget stabilization fund history. That's all there. All of our publications typically have these same reports based on a request of the legislature or action taken by the legislature. But these are the same types of information you'll find in our front-end publications across the board. We want to make sure you can look back at least a couple years and get some trends and some snapshots to make sure that you all have the information you need when you go back home for your constituents. I'm going to go over just a couple of them. I know Ms. Jessup brought one of these up on the screen a minute ago with the major benchmarks. This is what we call our Gen Dead Fed report, because the columns, you have an FTP column and then you have a Gen for general, Dead for dedicated, and Fed for federal. It's easier, and in today's day and age, we just like to truncate words apparently. So, Gen Dead Fed, it just summarizes it to those levels. So again, you get to that middle column of dedicated. That's a lot of funds and a lot of agencies. And so you really got to kind of dive in when you work those budgets just to see what exactly is that dedicated fund source. And we've given you all that information in our fiscal source book. The way this report reads, as Ms. Jessup went over, we start at that first benchmark, the original appropriation, and we work our way all the way down to the original appropriation moving forward. What you have on the screen before you is found on page 12 of your budget book. This is the agency's request. Every agency, every decision unit, all rolled up into a single sheet. And it's going to show you that agencies are requesting a 4.8% increase on their general fund and 5.4% increase compared to their total appropriation. You have all the information you need as you go through this report. I've obviously removed a little bit to fit it onto one screen. That's going to be on the left-hand page. If your book was in front of you, that paper copy, it'd be on the left, and you'd be able to see side by side, which Idaho law requires, the governor's recommendation on the next page. Exact same format, but what the governor is requesting of the legislature to consider in his recommendation. The difference is now you have the 2.2% submitted number and a 2.8% compared to the total appropriation. You can lay them out side by side. What is the request for CEC? What is the governor's recommendation? You'll see the 1% versus the 3%. And you can just kind of bounce between the two. Or if you're scrolling on your documents, shrink them down really small to make them side by side. The other common front-end report, these are what we call our statewide reports. And this just takes all of our agencies onto a single sheet, with the exception of self-governing agencies and those under the office of the governor. They kind of roll up into one row. But what you see is, you're going to see the current year appropriation. You're going to see what the agencies are requesting. How much is it changing by dollar, and how much is it changing by percentage? This format, you're going to see several reports that outline this way. I'm just highlighting the first one, just so you can see how this works. We've got public school support happens to be the first agency. The superintendent is requesting $77.6 million in new general funds for a 2.9% increase. All of education requests are $140 million or 4.2%. That's on the request. For the general fund for the governor is recommending 12.5 million new ongoing general funds for a 0.5%. And for all of education, $77.3 million for 2.3%. So again, you can lay them out side by side and get that high-level picture just to see, okay, how do we compare in these agencies as we go down the page? And every sheet should be titled Request, Recommendation, General Fund, All Funds. All funds is general, dedicated, and federal, all rolled up into one. So you can look at the whole picture for everything as well as just the general fund. Any questions so far? Doing okay? All right. So for each agency, you're going to see a division summary, a division fund analysis report, a comparative report that's side by side that Ms. Jessup had on the screen that shows the request to the governor's rec for the general fund and all funds, and what we call our decision details, or DU, decision unit details page. A handful of agencies, such as public schools and health and welfare and a couple others, will have a department level summary. Because they're so big, we want to give you 2 summaries, and then a department level comparative. Because you want to see in public schools, for example, you want to see all of the requested changes in teachers, operations, facilities, etc., all on one sheet to see what is public schools as a whole, not just each individual division and piece. Okay? And then occasionally we throw in what we call informational pages to help explain or help you understand whatever's in that budget, such as common terms like what is a support unit? How is this? What are the lottery and or liquor dividends provided back to the state? Where do they go? How much was it? So you can have that reference to see where does it all portray without the whole budget. And real quick, we're going to walk through. And I apologize for not bringing it up sooner. One agency, and then I promise I will be done. All right, and I've already warned Mr. Tucker that I will be using public television as my example. This is the division summary page. You will see this for every single agency. It's going to break down if there's multiple programs, you'll see those listed at the top. You're going to see by fund category, general, dedicated, and federal. You're going to see it by the object of expenditure. How much is personnel costs? How much is operating? How much is capital outlay? Right? And then you're going to have down at the bottom, you're going to have a description. What is it that that agency does? In this case, this is public television's write-up that I provided. It's just a high level, what is it the agency does? What's in their budget? Where does it live? And you can see that what's last year's appropriation, what did they actually spend? What's this year's appropriation? What are they asking for? What is the governor recommending? Oh. Then you're going to see this comparative page. You're going to see for public television is their appropriation in 23, their actual expenditures in 23, and what was the variance for every fund. So for public television, it's 2 funds in this example, so it's pretty quick. But when you get to the Department of Agriculture, this is a full sheet of a lot of funds. And so you're going to be able to see everywhere that they're spending money and how much variance there is from the appropriation versus what they're actually spending. And then each analyst, if need be, can get you 10 years, 5 years, whatever a trend, so you can start to look and go, okay, how is their budget? Is it right sized? Where can they afford? What can we do? You can start to put those pieces together. Then you have the comparative page. This comparative, again, agency request side by side with the governor's recommendation for every decision unit all the way through as requested and recommended. And then finally in the details, and this is the reason I picked public television. You have in the original appropriation box just a couple sentences reminding you, the committee, what JFAC and the legislature approved for the current year. So what's in this year's budget? In this case, they got some money from the Millennium Fund to do some campaign work on anti-vape. Prior year reappropriation. Any agency that received reappropriation from any fund should have a write-up comparable to what you see on the screen that says why monies were appropriated from what fund and for whatever that purpose was. So you can have that refresher of the authorization you all have provided that agency for whatever the reasons were. If there's a supplemental or a rescission, that'll show up as well. Executive carry forward, the exact same thing as reappropriation. In this case, they were approved for executive carry forward for microwave radio systems and some routers and a translator because they weren't able to make the payments before the fiscal year closed. It was truly an accounting timing issue. And with that encumbrance happening last year going, we just can't meet June 30th, let's keep that whole piece of the puzzle, all of it together into the very next year. So that way the expenditure shows up in the year it's expended and we know exactly what the agency spent that year, right? And this write-up's going to say what they encumbered it for, why they encumbered it. Any other details we'll have to ask DFM. You're going to see other one-time and base adjustments.
Mr. Tadro, can I ask you a question? Back
Sure.
up a little bit, if you would, please. So where we have the executive carry forward, I'm assuming, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that let's say we appropriated 300,000 and they spent 100,000. The carry forward, we're just going to show the 200,000. So only the 200,000 is going to be repeated as an expense in both the prior year and in this year.
Mr. Chairman, it won't be recorded as an expenditure in the prior year.
Will not be.
Nope. It's only, the new law says that an expenditure will be recorded in the year it's expended.
Okay.
Prior to that law, and this committee passed that law, or did the bill, but it was recorded as expended in the year it was appropriated.
Right.
The problem with that is it could have been encumbered for 5 years. And so we just said it was expended. Well, if they cancel that, they never bought the car. They never, it just disappears, right? We never knew what actually took place unless you really went back and found it. And it was kind of a search.
Okay.
So the law was changed to say, if you appropriated $300,000 for some cars, you can't get them purchased in the time frame, which is not uncommon. Right. Just because of our state contract, it just happens. That appropriation moves into the next year. And then when you spend it, then we record the expenditure against that appropriation. And if you cancel it, it shows as reverted. So
Perfect.
Everything stays in the year that it actually took place.
Perfect, thank you.
You bet. You're going to see all the maintenance stuff. In this case, public television has benefit costs. They have inflationary adjustments. Their rent is going up. They have some replacement items. You should see a description of what is it they're asking to be replaced. Standby cost allocation and CEC. It's all there laid out, followed by any line items or other budget law exemptions or other adjustments. So as you go through every agency, it follows the same format. And like Ms. Jessup said, it's all building blocks. The question is which blocks are going to be included in that ask. But every budget book should be outlined this exact same structure. So, any questions?
Questions from the committee? I don't see any. Madam Chair, anything else you'd like to add? Questions, comments? Did that cover both of your little topics here or just the one?
Oh, yes, sir, both.
I thought you were rolling on through, and I appreciate it. Thank you, sir. That brings us to the end then, because we'd like to end at least 15 minutes before floor time to give you the time you need to get ready. And so that's perfect because Mr. Hibbard then didn't, and Christy and Otto, Miss Otto, will both be tomorrow. So we'll work on the agenda to determine if you're first, if we follow up with that, or we do the audits first, or just how we do it, we'll let you know. So with that, with no further questions, seeing none, we are adjourned until tomorrow morning, and we'll try 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hopefully the snow won't be bad. We'll see you at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Hardware and closed captioning for Idaho in Session is provided by the Idaho Legislature